A bright young woman disappears. Nearly 25 years later, she suddenly emerges from a secret chamber of horrors. Number 2 on our list, the shocking saga of Elizabeth Fritzl. Joseph Fritzl was a successful electrical engineer. He and his wife Rosemary raised 7 children in their home in Amstetten, Austria. Daughter Elizabeth was born in 1966.
It's known that by the age of 11, Joseph Fritzl was already making sexual advances towards her. It's known that she was already suffering the effects of incest.
According to published reports, Elizabeth ran away in her teens. But she eventually returned to Amstetten to study for a career in the hotel and restaurant business. By 1984, the 18-year-old lined up a job in northern Austria, far from home and her father.
I think 2 things happened in his delusional system. 1, he realized he couldn't control her. And 2, she was now becoming sexual.
He ultimately decided one afternoon that it was time to capture her, physically luring her to the basement and then barricading her in an underground dungeon.
For more than 2 decades, Fritzl conducted an elaborate scheme to cover his tracks.
He told his wife she'd run away. He forced her not only to write letters detailing why she ran away, but also to make audio recordings so that his wife would believe that their daughter was simply missing. She was held against her will, year after year, rape after rape, until she bore 7 children.
3 of the children ended up living with Joseph and his wife. In these cases, Joseph would leave the baby on the front step with a note from Elizabeth.
People said that it was irresponsible. What a bad mother Elizabeth was, just to leave the children on the doorstep. Frau Fritzl already had 7 children, and now she had to bring up grandchildren as well. Terrible.
The truth was even more shocking. According to court documents, one of Elizabeth's children died shortly after birth. Court records also showed that Joseph Fritzl threw the infant's dead body into an incinerator. Meanwhile, for more than 20 years, Elizabeth and 3 of her children were forced to live in unspeakable conditions.
The environment in this room where the ceilings were kept very low, around 6 foot, the highest point. The environment was anything but pleasant.
Joseph Fritzl's wife was forbidden to go anywhere near the basement. Tenants who occupied a rental unit in the building were also warned to stay away. In the spring of 2008, Elizabeth's 19-year-old daughter Kirsten became critically ill. She'd spent her entire life underground.
She had a kidney disorder and she needed medical attention. And somehow, she was able to convince Joseph Fritzl to get Kirsten to the hospital.
Before healthcare workers could help Kirsten, they needed her medical history. Officials went on television and pleaded for the girl's mother to come forward.
The most remarkable thing is that Elizabeth had a television in the dungeon and was able to watch all of these stories as they played out on television. Eventually, she was able to convince Joseph to help save your daughter, your granddaughter. Eventually, he relented.
Joseph brought Elizabeth to the hospital. According to published reports, an anonymous tip persuaded hospital staffers to call police. Upon questioning, Elizabeth agreed to tell everything on the condition that she'd never have to see her father again.
This was an international story, nothing that people could ever believe or had ever heard of happening.
In March of 2009, Joseph Fritzl was charged with 6 offenses, including incest, forced imprisonment, enslavement, and negligent homicide related to the death of his infant son. Fritzl pled guilty to incest and forced imprisonment. He pled not guilty to negligent homicide and enslavement.
I think one of the most compelling aspects of this case was this man that everyone saw as such a horrendous predator, someone who preyed upon his innocent daughter, fathered children with her, all of a sudden an about-face.
During their arguments, the prosecution presented videotaped testimony by Elizabeth Fritzl. Afterward, Joseph changed his plea to guilty on all charges.
It's like you had two locomotives heading for a crash on separate tracks. You had a psychotic schizophrenic illness, and you had a sexual deviance underneath that. And I think what happened is once that little healthy kind of non-psychotic part of him still had a feeling for his daughter, as warped and all as it was.
Joseph Fritzl was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a psychiatric ward. Elizabeth was reunited with her mother and all 6 children. The family underwent extensive psychiatric treatment and is now living in an undisclosed location.
I don't know that you can live through a crime like this and ever find normalcy in your life. I'm rather certain these children will never be normal, and I'm rather certain that Elizabeth will never, ever, ever get over this.
Up next, 14 years old, in the hands of a madman.
I thought this was just another case where maybe years later they'd find my remains.
Elizabeth Smart's Fight for Life. When we return, our exclusive interview.